Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther were at breakfast in the parlour of Westfield Hall in the county of Essex. They were arranging plans for the day. "George," said Mrs. Anstruther, "I think you had better go to Malden and see if you can get any of those knitted things I was speaking about which would do for my stall at the bazaar." "Oh, well, if you wish it, Mary, of course I can do that. But I had half arranged to play a round with Geoffrey Williamson this morning. What shall you do yourself?" "Why, when the work of the house is arranged for, I must see about laying out my new rose garden. By the way, before you start out for Malden, I wish you would just take Collins to look at the place I fixed upon. You know it, of course." "Oh, yes. Where we were saying there must have been a summer house once. The place with the old seats and the posts. But do you think there's enough sun there?" "My dear George, do allow me some common sense. There will be plenty of sun when we've got rid of some of the box bushes. All I want Collins to do is clear away the old posts and seats and things before I come out in an hour's time. And I hope you will manage to get off fairly soon." Within a few minutes, Mr. Anstruther had discovered Collins in the greenhouse, and they were on their way to the site of the projected rose garden. I am inclined to believe that Mrs. Anstruther, though in the habit of describing herself as a great gardener, had not been well advised in her selection of a spot for the purpose. It was a small, dark clearing, bounded on one side by a path, and on the other by thick box bushes, laurels, and other evergreens. The ground was almost bare of grass and dark of aspect. Remains of rustic seats and an old corrugated oak post somewhere near the middle of the clearing had given rise to Mr. Anstruther's conjecture that a summer house had once stood there. Clearly, Collins had not been put in possession of his mistress's intentions with regard to this plot of ground, and when he learnt them from Mr. Anstruther, he displayed no enthusiasm. "Of course, I could clear them seats away soon enough," he said. "But that's firm in the ground, that post is. That's been there a number of years, Mr. Anstruther. I doubt I shan't get that up, not quite so soon as what I can do with them seats." "But your mistress specially wishes it to be got out of the way in an hour's time," said Mr. Anstruther. Collins smiled and shook his head slowly. "You'll excuse me, sir, but you feel of it for yourself. No, sir, no one can't do what's impossible to him, can they, sir? I could get that post up by after tea time, sir, but that'll want a lot of digging. What you require, sir, you see, sir, if you'll excuse me naming of it, you want the soil loosening round this post here, and me and the boy, we shall take a little time doing of that." "Very well," sighed Mr. Anstruther. "I'll tell your mistress that you can see your way to clearing the seats at once and the post this afternoon. Good morning." Collins was left rubbing his chin. Mrs. Anstruther received the report with some discontent, but did not insist upon any changes of plan. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, she had just settled down to her sketch of the church as seen from the shrubbery, when a maid came hurrying down the path to say that Miss Wilkins had called. Miss Wilkins was one of the few remaining members of the family from whom the Anstruthers had bought the Westfield estate some years back. She'd been staying in the neighborhood, and this proved to be a farewell visit. The two ladies strolled through the grounds of the hall and eventually reached the site of the planned rose garden. The details of the project were laid before Miss Wilkins at some length, but her thoughts were evidently elsewhere. "Yes, delightful," she said at last, rather absently. "But do you know, Mrs. Anstruther, I'm afraid I was thinking of old times, and how neither my brother Frank nor I would ever care to be alone in this place when we were children. But one very hot autumn day, I was looking for Frank to fetch him to tea, and going down this path, I suddenly saw him asleep on the bench in the old summer house with such a dreadful look on his face that I really thought he must be ill or even dead. I rushed at him and shook him and told him to wake up, and wake up he did with a scream. I assure you the poor boy seemed almost beside himself with fright. It came out at last that he'd had a very odd, disjointed dream. First he made out that he was standing in a large room with a number of people in it, and someone was opposite to him who was very powerful, and questions were asked which he felt to be very important. All the voices sounded to him very distant, but he remembered bits of things that were said. Where were you on the 19th of October? Is this your handwriting? And so on. I can see now, of course, that he was dreaming of some trial. But it was odd that a boy of 8 could have such a vivid idea of what went on in a court. He said that all the time he felt the most intense anxiety and oppression and hopelessness. Then, after that, there came another sort of picture. He was being taken through a street. It was very cold, and then he was led up some creaking wooden steps and stood on a sort of platform, but the only thing he could actually see was a fire burning somewhere near him. Someone who had been holding his hand left hold of it and went towards his fire, and if I had not wakened him up, he didn't know what would have become of him. A curious dream for a child to have, wasn't it? Well, so much for that. It must have been later in the year that I was sitting in the arbour just about sunset reading a book. All at once I became conscious that someone was whispering to me. The only words I could distinguish were something like, "Pull, pull, I'll push, you pull." I started up in something of a fright. The voice sounded so hoarse and angry, and yet as if it came from a long, long way off, just as it had done in Frank's dream. But it was strongest when I put my ear to an old post, which was part of the end of the seat. In fact, it was just like that post you have there. My father got to know that both of us had had a fright in the arbour, and he went down there himself one evening after dinner, and the arbour was pulled down at very short notice. I recollect hearing my father talking about it to an old man who used to do odd jobs in the place, and the old man saying, "Don't you fear for that, sir. He's sound enough in there so long as no one lets him out." But when I asked who it was, I could get no satisfactory answer. I've often asked the older people in the village whether they knew of anything strange, but either they knew nothing or they wouldn't tell me. The conversation moved on, and Miss Wilkins took her leave shortly afterwards. The seats and the posts were cleared away and uprooted, respectively, by that evening. During dinner time, Mrs. Collins sent up and asked for a little brandy because her husband had taken a nasty chill and she was afraid he would not be able to do much next day. Mrs. Anstruther's reflections the next morning were not wholly placid. She was sure some roughs had got into the plantation during the night. "And another thing, George, the moment Collins is about again, you must tell him to do something about the owls. I never heard anything like them, and I'm positive one came and perched somewhere just outside our window. Didn't you hear it? No, of course you were sound asleep as usual. Still, I must say, George, you don't look as if your night had done you much good. My dear, I feel as if another of the same would turn me silly. You have no idea of the dreams I had. First, I was in an old-fashioned sort of panelled room. I remembered there was a fireplace with a lot of burnt papers in it, and I was in a great state of anxiety about something. Next, I heard several people coming upstairs and a noise like spurs on a boarded floor, and then the door opened and whatever it was I was expecting happened. Then I was in a large room, panelled, I think, like the other, and I was evidently being tried for my life, I've no doubt, from the state I was in. I had no one speaking for me, and somewhere there was a fearful fellow. On the bench, I should have said, only that he seemed to be pitching into me most unfairly, and twisting everything I said, and asking most abominable questions about dates when I was at particular places and letters I was supposed to have written and why I had destroyed some papers. And I recollect his laughing at answers I made in a way that quite daunted me. I am quite certain that there was such a man once, and a most horrible villain he must have been. After that, I was taken outside. Was it a dark, cold day, and a fire burning somewhere near you? Why, George, yes it was. And someone was holding on to my arm, and I remember seeing a ladder and hearing the sound of a lot of people. I've no doubt it was an execution for high treason, but Mary, I know what you are going to ask. I suppose this is an instance of a kind of thought reading. Miss Wilkins called yesterday and told me of a kind of dream her brother had as a child when they lived here, and something did no doubt make me think of that when I was awake last night listening to those owls and those men talking and laughing in the shrubbery, and so, I suppose, from my brain it must have got into yours while you were asleep. Curious, no doubt. And I'm sorry it gave you such a bad night. After lunch, Mrs. Anstruther settled herself comfortably upon her sketching chair on the path leading through the shrubbery to the side gate of the churchyard. She worked hard, and the drawing was becoming a really pleasant thing to look upon by the time that the wooded hills to the west had shut out the sun. She rose and turned towards the house, pausing for a time to take delight in the limpid, green western sky. As she stood there, something rustled in the box bush on her left. and she turned and started at seeing what at first she took to be a 5th of November mask peeping out among the branches. She looked a little closer. It was not a mask. It was a face. Large, smooth, and pink. She remembers the minute drops of perspiration which were starting from its forehead. She remembers how the jaws were clean-shaven and the eyes shut. She remembers also, and with an accuracy which makes the thought intolerable to her, how the mouth opened and a single tooth appeared below the upper lip. As she looked, the face receded into the darkness of the bush. The shelter of the house was gained and the door shut before she collapsed. Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther had been for a week or more recruiting at Brighton before they received a circular from the Essex Archaeological Society and a query as to whether they possessed certain historical portraits which it was desired to include in the forthcoming work on Essex portraits, to be published under the Society's auspices. This was an accompanying letter from the Secretary, which contained the following passage. We are especially anxious to know whether you possess the original of the engraving of which I enclose a photograph. It represents the Lord Chief Justice under Charles II, who, as you doubtless know, retired after his disgrace to Westfield, and is supposed to have died there of remorse. It may interest you to hear that the parish was so much troubled after his death that the rector of Westfield summoned the parsons of all the neighbouring parishes to come and lay him, which they did. A curious entry in the register at Prior's Roothing notes that the stake is in the field adjoining to the churchyard of Westfield on the west side. Perhaps you can let us know if any tradition to this effect is current in your parish. The incidents which the enclosed photograph recalled were productive of a severe shock to Mrs. Anstruther. It was decided that she should spend the winter abroad. Mr. Anstruther, when he went down to Westfield to make the necessary arrangements, not unnaturally told his story to the rector, who showed little surprise. Yes, he said, it was bad at first, like owls, as you say, and men talking sometimes. One night it was in this garden, and at other times about several of the cottages. But lately there has been very little. I think it'll die out. There is nothing in our registers except the entry of the burial, and what I for a long time took to be the family motto. But last time I looked at it, I noticed that it was added quite late in the 17th century. Quieta non movere. Do not disturb the peace. Or as we would say, let sleeping dogs lie. And I suppose, well, rather hard to say exactly what I do suppose.